Hello, it's Dr. Carin here. How are you doing today? I hope you had a great weekend. It is July 6th, Monday, and today, actually over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about hormones, insulin, female hormones, testosterone, PCOS, perimenopause, menopause, fertility. So today I wanted to kick things off by talking about perimenopause and the three common causes I see for a lot of those perimenopausal symptoms. And so hopefully we can give you some insight into what's going on with your hormones. As a reminder, if you want to find out when we're going to be doing our next video and get the topics and get the summary notes, click on the link in the video description and you'll get those delivered to your inbox. And so Honey is saying, hi, Dr. Karen. Hi, so Honey, so nice to see you today. Thanks for joining me. I hope you're having a great day. We'll get right into the topic today. So 3 common causes of heavy periods and hormone imbalance in perimenopause. So let me start by asking you this. Do you dread getting your period? For 1 or 2 weeks before your period, do you feel like almost like someone else? You have irritability and anxiety, can't sleep properly, you have headaches, bloating, feeling heavy, feeling puffy. Are you constantly fighting low iron because of heavy periods and getting anemia, getting fatigued, of course, from that as well? Or do you feel like you're getting even things that feel like teenage hormone issues, like acne coming up, or things that seem like menopause symptoms, like hot flashes, night sweats, difficulty with sleep, or irregular periods, or maybe even a combination of many of those? What kind of symptoms have you experienced? Drop them in the comments now. I'd love to see. If you are experiencing any of these symptoms, you are definitely not alone. These are some of the common symptoms I hear about from my patients as they're going through perimenopause, and some of these symptoms can be so strong and severe. So I wanted to share with you 3 key factors that often are underlying these hormone imbalances, and of course how to get started on rebalancing. So what's happening here is from our 30s and our 40s, we can start to see the results of these small, subtle changes in our hormones that have accumulated over months or years. And given these imbalances and how incredibly powerful they can be on how we feel and think, I completely understand how somebody could dread their period and the certain times of their cycle. Some people have these very strong symptoms for 25 or 50% of their cycle. That's a huge amount of time to feel uncomfortable. Many of my patients say that they feel like they don't feel like themselves, they feel disconnected from their body, and almost like they're fighting against their body. The good news here is when our hormones are healthy, they're also still powerful, and they can help us to actually feel the opposite things, feel grounded, feel resilient. So I want to talk more about how to do that, how to work with our hormones. Now, nature works in cycles. A healthy ecosystem depends on and actually thrives off of changes in our essentially cycles, different rhythms. Things are not always the same in nature, right? They change and they cycle. And of course, women's menstrual cycle is similar to that. And I think this reflects nature's ability to continue to regenerate herself, and that's an incredible power. In traditional Chinese medicine, maybe you've seen that yin and yang symbol, that's that black and white symbol, and that's something that represents not only balance, not only the balance of opposing forces, yin and yang, but also if you look at the shape of it, it looks like something that's moving in a spiral. It's not just half of it white and half of it black. It's kind of this black and white that's moving towards each other. That's why we call this kind of a dynamic balance instead of just equal or balance. This really represents that cycle, the cycles that we see in nature and in our bodies as well. in traditional Chinese medicine, these life cycles are incredibly important. In fact, not just the menstrual cycle, but within our whole life, it's seen as a cycle as well. So in Western physiology, we sort of see women's hormone cycles being in just basically 3 phases. So before your period, during the period, and menopause. But in traditional Chinese medicine, we actually see it as cycles of 7 years. That every 7 years, there's the beginning of this new and important phase of our life. For men, by the way, it's every 8 years. So for example, for women, for every 7 years, age 14 being the time of the onset of periods, and then age 49 being the transition to menopause, for example. So in traditional Chinese medicine, that cycles are not only acknowledged to exist, but are considered really important parts of health and life in general. So we know that these cycles exist. We know that they're part of a healthy system. So how does it get off? How do we end up getting these imbalances in the yin and yang and in our hormones? Well, a lot of our modern life is designed around the workforce instead of the cycles of nature. So unfortunately, that disconnect from the cycles of nature can eventually lead us to see our own cycles as something that's more inconvenient, instead of listening to what our body is doing and adjusting our lives to that. We tend to do kind of the other way around. So I think before we get into the imbalances, I'll just do a really, really quick little review on just what happens in our cycle. Because of course, hormone fluctuations themselves are normal and healthy. So let's just review that. For the purpose of this, I'm going to go through the period in a 28-day cycle, but obviously it's different for everyone. You can have a 3-week to a 5-week long cycle, but for this purpose, I'll just do a 4-week one. So day 1 is the period. It's the first day. It's considered the first day of your cycle, where there's a shedding of that uterine lining. During this time, your estrogen, progesterone, essentially all of your hormones across the board are low level. So low amounts of these hormones. So generally this is if you're wondering about fasting, for example, this might be the best time in your cycle to do a little bit of fasting, because those hormones aren't stimulating your appetite very much during this time. And then as we go into the next week, say days 7 to 14, your estrogen levels are rising during this time. Now, estrogen level is a really important growth hormone. So it's actually driving the growth of a follicle, an egg. But during that time, you are also going to feel oftentimes the estrogen maybe even making your lips feel plumper or your cheeks feel a little bit plumper. Your skin can feel a little bit softer or clearer. Oftentimes this day, 7 to 14-ish, is when a lot of women just feel the best during their cycle, the most attractive during this time. This is also the time when testosterone is rising as well. So maybe a little bit more interested in sex around this time, and also a good time to put a little bit more intensity in exercise, a little bit more resistance, heavier weights perhaps during this time. So now that leads us to sort of mid-cycle, around day 14 to 16. This is when ovulation can occur. So ovulation meaning the follicle actually releases that egg. And this essentially kicks off the second half of the cycle called luteal phase. The luteal phase, we do see the estrogen continuing to rise, and that actually thickens up that uterine lining again. But really the star here during the luteal phase, it's all about the progesterone. We're going to talk more about progesterone in a second here. This is an amazing hormone. But one of the things that it does is it stimulates the appetite. It slows down the bowels. Maybe you've kind of noticed that you get a little bit more constipated right before your period. That's that progesterone levels being a little bit higher. And so around this time, it's a good time to increase your green leafy vegetables and fiber in your diet. And you might notice in this phase that you're a little bit more introverted as well. And because of that increased energy that we need to thicken up that uterine lining, that creates a lot of need for energy. So decreasing your intensity of exercise during this time can sometimes feel better. So basically, I just gave you a real fast rundown on how you can see that your optimal health and your hormones really requires adjustments in exercise and nutrition and rest and recovery in order to support those fluctuations that we see from week to week, or even day to day that's happening. So hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of why you're feeling different things, and they're not necessarily problems. They're just what your hormones are doing naturally. But we certainly can get problems. So let me talk more about that. So overall, estrogen progesterone levels are naturally and gradually declining through our 30s, 40s, 50s. This by itself does not necessarily cause symptoms, but where we do see symptoms is where that decline is happening at different rates. So most typically what we're seeing is that the progesterone declines faster than the estrogen. For example, progesterone can drop 75%, whereas estrogen drops 35%. So you can see that both of them dropped, but there's going to end up being a lot more estrogen when we're comparing those two. So this leads me to those three most common causes I see underlying those perimenopausal symptoms, including heavy periods. So first one is relative estrogen dominance. So this is that same thing that we just mentioned. Although the estrogen generally is lower, it's compared to progesterone high. So we talked previously when we were reviewing the cycle that estrogen is a really important growth hormone. It helps to rebuild body tissue. But with our modern lifestyle, we can end up having too much estrogen, and that can actually change the way we feel, our mood. It can make our periods heavier, and unfortunately that can also increase the risk of breast and endometrial cancers. So it can be quite a dangerous thing if that goes unchecked for a long time. Now, how does this estrogen dominance happen? Few different ways. So high insulin is one of the first thing that can trigger this pathway. So when we have high insulin levels, and that could be because we're eating too much sugar or eating too much carbohydrates, or simply just eating too many times all the time without fasting in between, that can lead to excess body fat. And within the fat cells, you can have testosterone and cortisol actually converted to estrogen. So that also means that if you have more cortisol, and that's increasing chronic stress levels, obviously is triggering higher cortisol, that can actually drive more estrogen production. So insulin, increasing fat production, chronic stress, increasing cortisol, both of those leading to more conversion to estrogen levels in the body. And then only to make matters worse, environmental chemicals, there's a lot of those chemicals that can actually have these estrogen-like effects on the body. They can actually bind to those estrogen receptors. These are often called xenoestrogens, or outside or foreign estrogens. We are all exposed to these, unfortunately, in commercially raised meat products, in pesticides, in produce, parabens in shampoos, cosmetics, and yes, they can be absorbed through the skin as well. It's not always just about eating them. Phthalates in soft plastics, BPA in the lining of cans. It's really all over. Heavy metals like mercury as well can affect our hormones. So many of these different things that we are in regular contact with every day can affect our estrogen receptors and essentially have this estrogen-like action on our body. So obviously the avoidance of many of these toxic chemicals are really important. And of course the detoxification of these compounds are equally important to balancing out that estrogen. Okay, second common cause to perimenopausal symptoms that we're seeing is progesterone depletion. Now, it certainly can happen that you can have too much progesterone, but by far, most of the time we're seeing progesterone being low. as I mentioned before, progesterone, if I have a favorite hormone in the body, this might be it. Progesterone is an amazing hormone. It has effects on our brain. It can be it almost acts like an antidepressant. It helps us to use fat for energy. We want that. It protects us from cancer, so it helps to manage the effects of estrogen, protecting us from cancer, and it helps to maintain that uterine lining, so it helps to prevent that excess bleeding. If you've experienced spotting, for example, before periods, or even for a long time afterwards, like tapering for a long time, if you're bleeding for 6, 7, 8 plus days, progesterone levels might be a little bit low for you. Now, why the progesterone levels are getting low, there's multiple reasons here, but one of the main ones is that cortisol, that stress hormone, and progesterone actually share the same starting ingredient. So when the demand for cortisol is quite high, meaning when we have a lot of stress or we have stress for a long time, our body prioritizes cortisol to get that ingredient instead of progesterone. So over time, the progesterone levels get lower and lower and lower if we continue to have that stress and that cortisol pumping. So I hope that makes sense so far. We talked about that higher estrogen level and what causes that, and then the lower progesterone levels and how stress can have a huge impact on that. And with both of those, if you kind of put them together, of course, tipping the scales even more when you're comparing them, having that estrogen building that uterine lining, so essentially making that lining thicker so there might be more bleeding, and then the progesterone, lower level of progesterone, not controlling that bleeding as much, you can see how you can get heavy periods with both of those together. Any questions so far, please let me know. Just drop them in the comments. My third common cause here that I wanted to mention is what we call liver congestion. One of the many functions of the liver is clearing the hormones from the body, and especially in the case of estrogen, slowing down of this function can just make those perimenopausal symptoms even worse. But how is it that your liver function gets compromised? That's really the big question here. The liver, we often talk about it as the big important filter in our body, but it's not like a colander in your sink that just like drains water passively. The liver actually filters using a lot of energy and a lot of antioxidants and nutrients. It's a very active, energy-dependent process. So if it doesn't have enough of those antioxidants and vitamins, then it can't do its job properly. And then on top of that, of course, if there are a lot of chemicals, like we mentioned before, those environmental toxins, which the liver also has to clear many of those, if we have that on top of not enough nutrients to support detoxification, then we get that liver congestion, that liver just not being able to keep up. And the difficulty here is that oftentimes we don't have signs from the liver that this is happening because we don't have pain receptors in the liver. Oftentimes it's just the hormone imbalance itself being the first sign that we have to support the liver. On top of that, we mentioned insulin issues before, making estrogen worse. Insulin issues can also actually slow down liver function even more as well. I have a question here. So how do you boost progesterone in your body? Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. So number one, and the first most important thing, is to just making sure that we're not continuously activating stress hormone for you. Because sometimes we know when we're stressed, and sometimes we don't realize that we're continuously activating our stress response. So being really careful about that. The other part is, and I'll go more into this in a moment, but there are herbs. Herbs are my favorite way of really supporting your body to be able to have the ingredients to make more progesterone on its own. And then of course to help with your adrenal glands, which is making that cortisol, to help support that so it's not triggering that stress response so often. So there's a few different approaches that normally have to be taken to help to boost that progesterone. So you can see, I hope that was answered your question here. You can see with what we've talked about that there's chronic stress, there's environmental toxins, there's our diet and how it affects our insulin levels, and all of these things in our modern life that can contribute to the estrogen dominance, to the progesterone deficiency, and to the liver congestion. And that pushes our perimenopause hormone imbalances more. If we continue to ignore these signals or not address them, the symptoms can of course get worse. We can get more severe anemia. We can have a harsher transition to menopause, unfortunately. And of course, we talked about that higher risk of cancer that we really definitely want to address. But the good news is when we adjust the lifestyle, nutrition, exercise, liver support, and support our cycles, there's a huge potential here for rebalance. And my patients often describe this feeling as, oh my gosh, I feel like myself again. And that's always a good sign when you feel like, yes, essentially your body and your mind realigned again. That's always a good sign. So where do we get started? Number one, the first thing that I would do is just realign your relationship with your body and your cycles. Instead of fighting it, just listen for the clues, listen for what your body is saying. You may want to take notes throughout your cycle, not just when your period is, but also the symptoms that you have leading up to your period or during your period or throughout your cycle. It could be during, day 7, it could be during day 14, just to get an idea of what kind of symptoms you're having. And that gives us a clue about those hormone imbalances. And of course, gets support to interpret those symptoms if you need it. One of the most important things is deepening that time of self-care, especially it might be for you that week or two leading up to your period. You might feel a little bit more tired. You might feel a little bit more like you need your cave time, your alone time. Take that time when you can. We really need, instead of feeling kind of guilty for taking that time, make sure you take that time to listen to your body and follow your body's clues with that. Nurturing yourself as you nurture your family. So Honey is asking, are there any specific foods that mimic hormones? I think that's what we're saying here. Yeah, mimic female hormones, like tofu. Yeah. So I think you're mentioning essentially phytoestrogens. So dietary foods can have these plant estrogens in them. Generally speaking, and now this is different for each person because there's also like tofu, there's lots of people who have sensitivity to soy, so there are a lot of issues with that too. But generally speaking, if just talking about phytoestrogens are like weak estrogens. So because they compete for the same receptor as the strong estrogens, they can actually be quite helpful for balancing your hormones, for balancing too much estrogen. So it's an amazing way that nature has figured that out to actually help use plant estrogens to help to boost hormones if you actually need more, but also to use the same plants to actually reduce the strength of those strong hormones if that's what you need. So yeah, there are certain foods like soy is a big one. Wild yam is often talked about with that as well. Phytoestrogens are on lots of vegetables essentially. So we're talking about just nurturing ourselves and listening to your body and taking a break when you can. Someone said that, the quote, the brain is the most important organ in the body, according to the brain. Your brain is affected by your hormones. Your brain is not the boss. So listen to your body to really get a guide of what you need to do at each stage of your cycle. And once or twice a year, it's great to actually support your liver and actually reset your hormones with a metabolic detox. We talked about this, Sohani, the other day as well. And this is a 10-day program that can help to clear those environmental toxins, to balance your hormones, I could see the improvements in my own symptoms immediately in the following cycle after I did the 10-day detox. Personally, I can't wait to do the detox again because I felt so good afterwards. If you want to find out more about the 10-day detox, click on the link in the video description to register for the webinar, and we'll tell you all about that 10-day detox program. That's a really nice one, once or twice a year, to reset your hormones as well by really supporting your liver. Let me know if you have any other questions that are coming up. Love to hear from you. I hope that you were able to get a few insights today to give you a little idea of what might be going on for your hormones and where to get started. If you have any questions or comments, again, please let me know. If you have any specific topics about perimenopause, maybe there's a specific symptom that you're having a hard time with, let me know as well. And of course, please share this video with friends and family that you think could benefit from it. I'm so glad that you could join me today. It was so nice to see you again. Thanks for your questions, and I hope you have a great day. See you next time. Bye.